Those lying there are our comrades. Yesterday they were standing during the count. They were going to work, they were hungry and had lice, they were beaten. Yesterday they were suffering. Yesterday they wanted to die. Now they are naked corpses in the snow. These heartbreaking words belong to Charlotte Delbo, a French woman who was captured in 1942 as a member of her country's resistance and sent to Auschwitz-Birkenau along with 230 other female prisoners. She was one of the few who managed to survive, and her story is a reflection of more than 1 million people who did not have the same fate, suffering the brutality of the most lethal concentration camp of Nazism. In this new video, we will go back in time to learn about this factory of death from the inside, and mainly the suffering of women who had to endure inhuman treatment of all kinds during the years of the Second World War. We warn you, you are about to see the most savage acts in the history of humanity, a true living hell that the enemies of the Third Reich faced.
My major memories of Auschwitz are certainly being hungry and cold very often.
Nobody has anybody in Auschwitz.
I don't think that anybody, even us in Auschwitz, wanted to feel like a piece of meat. And we have been reduced, in this case, to a mass of breathing, living cells.
The name Auschwitz today represents the barbarity and the ultimate depravity to which a human being can fall. The indelible images that came to light after the liberation of this Nazi extermination camp allowed the entire world to know only a small part of the terrible martyrdom to which the prisoners were exposed. However, on this occasion, we will discover that story in depth. This camp, created by the Third Reich in the territory of occupied Poland, was located about 43 kilometers from Krakow. It was the largest, and throughout the Second World War it received about 1,300,000 prisoners, of whom 90% were Jews. It was opened on May 20th, 1940, as a place of confinement and forced labor. But a year later, its first commander, Rudolf Höss, was summoned to Berlin by the leader of the SS Heinrich Himmler. There, he informed him that the Führer had ordered the implementation of the so-called final solution to the problem with the Jewish population. It was simply a mass execution, and the Auschwitz camp had been designated for that purpose. For that reason, crematoriums were built in its facilities where the lifeless bodies would be burned after being killed in gas chambers. A highly lethal pesticide called Zyklon B would be used there, which had been previously tested on Soviet prisoners of war. All this key process in the killing plan caused the camp to expand. In October 1941, they began the construction of the new space called Birkenau, or Auschwitz II, which in March 1942 began to function as an extermination center for the hundreds of thousands of victims who were transported from all over Europe. But that was not all. The conditions inside the camp were so brutal that many times the living were jealous of those who were taken to the gas chamber.
You know, I remember times when death was a luxury, which literally you envied the people that were dead. Because he no longer has to go through this ordeal. He doesn't have to suffer, he's finished.
The selection and extermination process was planned and organized efficiently. When the train that arrived at the camp full of new prisoners stopped next to the platform, the victims got off and their belongings were placed on one side to be later sent to barracks where they were classified for later shipment to Germany. The people were forced to form 2 rows, one of men and one of women, so that the SS doctors could make a selection. This was done according to the individual's external appearance, so that their fate was decided by the analytical and racist eye of the Nazis. The weak and sick were the first to be sent to the gas chambers for execution, and before entering, they had to take off their clothes. When the doors closed, the Zyklon B capsules, which turned into aerosol on contact with the air, were thrown through a hole in the ceiling. After the poisoning, groups of Jewish inmates forced to work in the crematoria would open the doors, pull out the gold teeth and cut the women's hair. Later, they would take the corpses to the ovens to set them on fire. The bones were ground up and the ashes scattered around the surrounding areas. The routine of the camp was one of limitless cruelty and inhumanity, based on a system of punishment and torture from which only a few managed to survive. Between the victims of these harsh conditions and the mass killing orchestrated by the Third Reich, Auschwitz was the place of death for 1,100,000 people. However, as we mentioned at the beginning, on this occasion we will focus on the particularities that the female prisoners had to face.
There isn't any words for such a cruelty or unhuman cruelty. There isn't any word. That's why I didn't go to the writing class, because there is no words. And anyway, Auschwitz is not describable. There was one famous person that he tried to describe Auschwitz, and he said there's not enough paper and not enough ink in the world.
The history of women in the most famous concentration camp began to take shape with the first official transport to the site, which arrived in March 1942 with 999 women. Although there was already a group of Polish women detained at the facility, this significant number increased the quota of the gender and gave rise to two theories to explain this behavior. The first suggests that Nazism wanted to eliminate the fertile bearers of the next generation of Jews, but there is also a second that speaks of the fact that it was easier to get families to give up daughters than sons. Whatever the case, at that time the men under Adolf Hitler's command summoned people with lies, and no one imagined that the true intentions had to do with a fatal destiny. In fact, one of the young women who arrived at Auschwitz on that first trip said that they had been vilely deceived. Edith Grossman was a 17-year-old teenager in her native Slovakia when she saw a notice posted on the street saying that all unmarried Jewish girls aged 16 and older had to report to school to work. She had dreamed of becoming a doctor, while her older sister Leah wanted to be a lawyer. However, those aspirations were dashed 2 years earlier when Nazi Germany annexed their country. The Slovak government began implementing excessively harsh laws against the Jewish population, including revoking their right to be educated after the age of 14. After that, officials pressured all women to take advantage of the opportunity offered to them, where they would supposedly have a job in a boot factory for the troops of the Third Reich. Hundreds of stories like these gave rise to the first female chapter in Auschwitz, which, far from being marked by the dignity of a job, was the one that opened the doors to a terrible hell. In the days before the train carrying nearly 1,000 women arrived, the first mass murder of prisoners took place, with 144 young Polish women killed. It was against this backdrop that the new group arrived, and had only a few minutes to understand what awaited them. After nearly 12 hours in a cold carriage, they came upon a scene where German guards ordered men in striped uniforms to use sticks to push them off the train. These were prisoners who were forced to work and whispered to the new arrivals to move quickly because they did not want to hurt them. However, the brutality to which the victims of Nazism were exposed awakened the survival instinct, and if they had to hurt one of these women to save themselves, they would not hesitate. Such was the life that awaited the new prisoners.
To describe the scene is not possible. I can only give you an idea about it. Every time I talk about it,
I said to my mother, I said, I can't go on like this. I said, I'm going to kill myself. I'm going to touch the wires and I'm going to kill myself because I can't go on. Can't take it.
After their reception, the women understood that there was no work waiting for them. The barbed wire had been the sign that at first glance gave them clues that something was very wrong and announced only a world of darkness. Hunger, cold, beatings without reason, severe punishments, everything came quickly. They had arrived as healthy young women, but a diet with a quarter of the necessary calories was combined with exhausting work that included demolishing buildings and cleaning the swamp with their own hands, and that wore them out. They began to die slowly. As if that were not enough, one of the great sufferings due to their gender was added to this. forced prostitution. One of the most unknown chapters in the history of Auschwitz is the one that refers to the brothel that operated there. Most of the workers in the brothel were inmates of Birkenau blocks and were forced to have relationships with about 6 different men a day. Among the clients were prisoners who were compensated for carrying out the work required by the German soldiers. The prisoners obtained a Nazi voucher to access the building where this practice took place, and once there they underwent a medical examination. After the examination, they participated in a lottery to decide which of the rooms to go to and in what order. They had to wait for their turn, which was marked by a bell that rang every 15 minutes as a signal for all the prostitutes to change clients. The men convinced themselves that these women received good food and were allowed to go for walks as compensation for this work. But in reality, they were taking part in another of the brutal methods of torture of Nazism, perhaps one of the most vile for using the prisoners themselves to harm their peers.
I didn't know what to do, how to survive in Auschwitz. There were no rules, there were no briefings, there are now only rumors and experiences. That's all there was.
The implementation of brothels also had other aspects from the cruelty of the Germans. It is estimated that one of the objectives of the brothel was to contribute to the disappearance of homosexual relations, something that was punished by the regime. In this way, they sought to get men to participate in the initiative, and ignoring the sexual orientation of lesbians, they were forced to have sex with them. Now, both because of the work in the brothel and the vulnerability to beatings and rapes by the Nazi guards, pregnancies occasionally occurred. This was not well seen by the racial experts of the Third Reich, so the mother was forced to abort in a context where her life and that of the baby would surely suffer a fatal fate. In fact, many times it was the prisoners themselves who performed these interventions, since, like everything in Auschwitz, medicine was cruelly twisted.
So much of the detail of the experiment, I still do not remember, because the only way I could cope with it is by blocking it out. I would let my mind just take off into other directions. I closed my eyes and I thought maybe this is a nightmare. And if I close them and open them up again, maybe the whole thing will disappear. It didn't.
This concentration camp was the workplace of a large number of well-known Nazi medical experts, men who turned the clinics into brutal places, on par with the rest of the camp. Their involvement was related to the most atrocious crimes committed during World War II, and the women in this complex were their main target. The prisoners were subjected to a huge variety of unethical experiments, where, driven by the extermination program, it did not matter that the victims ended up dying, much less the suffering that could be caused in the process. According to figures such as the well-known Dr. Josef Mengele, who led many trials at Auschwitz, the terrible practices sought to carry out tests and learn about the treatment of diseases, discover how to heal wounds, or understand the tolerance of the human body to different scenarios. This perverse SS doctor was responsible for numerous deaths. On one occasion, he subjected a pregnant woman who had just arrived at this camp to painful tests. However, as she was able to endure and survive, she later waited until she gave birth to order her breasts to be tied with rope so that she could not breastfeed her baby. The goal was to find out how long the little girl could live without food. The mother used pieces of bread soaked in water to feed the child, but it did not work. The child became weak, and her stomach swelled from hunger. After several days of suffering, a Czech doctor who was also a prisoner at Auschwitz convinced the woman to inject the newborn with a lethal dose of morphine to end her agony, and so it was.
Although we think we know quite a lot about all the sinister and extreme policies and brutalities of the Nazi regime, perhaps we understand less and know less really about the extent and the parameters and the scale of the human medical experimentation that went on in the Nazi camps.
As mentioned above, some of the tests conducted by Nazi doctors were aimed at developing drugs and treatment methods for the injuries and diseases that German military personnel were exposed to on the battlefield. Thus, it was common for a perfectly healthy person to end up infected and then find out how they reacted to tests. Scientists used female camp inmates to test immunization compounds and antibodies for the prevention and treatment of contagious diseases such as malaria, typhus, tuberculosis, yellow fever, and infectious hepatitis.
In the wounding experiments, the doctors took perfectly healthy human beings and inflicted injuries upon them that were supposed to replicate war wounds, and they deliberately introduced foreign objects like shards of glass or splinters of wood, as well as deliberately introducing infection and bacteria to the wounds as well.
These were brutal experiments that only inflicted a little more pain on top of the suffering that was already part of the daily life of the prisoners in the bloodthirsty Auschwitz camp. In fact, practices of this type left a deep mark on those victims who managed to survive, but decades later they still have them very present in their memories.
What they did, they took you in and they inflicted wounds on you, and then to see how it would heal if soldiers were wounded like that.
Quite frankly, I don't think that any human being can ever be prepared for a place like Auschwitz.
A final example of this brutality was given by another of the camp's ruthless doctors, Dr. Karl Klauberg. He was one of those chosen to please Adolf Hitler's wishes for the prevalence of the German Aryan race. Since the extermination of Jews did not seem to be enough for the Führer, Klauberg was put in charge of a sterilization program in the laboratory of Block 10 at Auschwitz. His goal was to find an easy and cheap way to prevent as many women as possible from having children. With that in mind, he developed a non-surgical procedure that involved introducing a specially designed chemical irritant into the female reproductive organs, which produced severe inflammation. The preparation was intended for the uteruses of his test subjects and was applied without anesthesia. This caused enormous pain and permanent damage, as well as serious infections. After several weeks, the fallopian tubes closed and became blocked. Klauberg's experiments killed many of the women, while others were intentionally executed so that autopsies could be performed on them and compared. However, beyond the number of deaths, it is estimated that the brutal method ended up sterilizing around 700 prisoners. The Nazi authorities seemed more than satisfied with the conclusions of the experiment, but for all the prisoners who were exposed to the treatment, it was a true hell. Klauberg's laboratory was feared for its painful injections, but it was not the only one, and the brutality against the victims continued to add up to terrible procedures.
After one of the visits to the lab, I became extremely ill. There were two kinds of labs, and that's another very long story in itself. One lab I call the blood lab, because basically what they did, they would tie both hands with the rubber hose, and then from this arm they would take a lot of blood. On occasion, 5-6 vials to see how much blood a person can lose and still live.
The list could have continued endlessly if Adolf Hitler's regime had not been defeated by the Allied forces and the Soviet Union. In fact, it was the Red Army that was in charge of liberating the Auschwitz concentration camp on January 27, 1945. It was a day that would go down in history since it was the largest Nazi extermination camp, and that date was immortalized worldwide as the International Day of Commemoration in memory of the victims of the Holocaust. The Third Reich fell, and along with it the gigantic space collapsed. However, even in its final moments, Auschwitz managed to spread pain. When the Soviets made their entrance, most of the guards had already fled, anticipating the consequences that the arrival of the advance of Stalin's men would bring after their victory months before during Operation Bagration. It represented the liberation of the entire Soviet Union from Nazi occupation and gave way to the Russian offensive in Poland, eventually reaching Germany. As the soldiers entered, they could feel an unbearable stench invading them, and in front of them they found piles of shoes, corpses on the ground, Some people wandering aimlessly in subhuman conditions and frightened children shouting, "We are not Jews." At that time, there were 2,819 prisoners in Auschwitz, but for many, liberation came too late. Hundreds of prisoners too weak died in their beds or crowded into the buildings of the place. It was very difficult for the troops to establish a bond of trust with them and make them understand that they belonged to the Soviet army and were there to liberate them. All the pain and suffering of being locked up in the most lethal concentration camp had left an indelible mark of distrust and fear. This is how we come to the end of our video. We have experienced the true terror that was experienced in Auschwitz, especially with the brutal treatment of the women who spent their days in that savage camp. And now it is time to say goodbye. Thank you very much for having joined us. We look forward to seeing you in our next installment to continue learning about the entire military history together.